November 12, 2001. Just 2 months after the terror attacks that changed America forever, New York was still grieving. The wounds of September 11th were raw and fresh. The city was on edge. Every unusual sound, every low-flying aircraft, every unexpected noise triggered memories of that September morning when the world changed forever. The skyline was different now. The Twin Towers were gone. Lower Manhattan was still smoldering. Thousands of families were still burying their loved ones. First responders were still searching through rubble. And every New Yorker carried the weight of that trauma with them every single day. At John F. Kennedy International Airport, the morning of November 12th seemed like any other. Aircraft lined up for departure. Ground crews loaded baggage. Passengers said goodbye to loved ones at the gate. The rhythms of commercial aviation continued, even as the nation remained on high alert. But the passengers boarding American Airlines Flight 587 that morning had no idea they were about to become part of aviation history, for all the wrong reasons. This is the story of how an experienced crew, a sophisticated aircraft designed with the latest technology, and a seemingly routine departure combined in the most catastrophic and unexpected way possible. This is the story of the deadliest accident on American soil since September 11th. This is the story of what really happened to Flight 587. The accident aircraft was an Airbus A300 605R, tail number November 14053. It had been in service since 1988, accumulating over 37,000 flight hours. Its maintenance records were impeccable. Nothing raised any red flags. The captain, 42 years old, was a former Air Force pilot with over 8,000 flight hours. His colleagues described him as confident, respected, and extremely competent. One fellow pilot said, quote, "I couldn't imagine him panicking." The first officer was 34, with over 4,400 hours of flight time. Friends and family painted a picture of a health-conscious professional who loved his job. The night before the accident, he told a friend he was excited about the trip because he enjoyed working with this captain. They were heading to Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. A one-day round trip, home for dinner. 251 passengers boarded that morning, including 5 lap children under 2 years old. Many were Dominican families heading home for the holidays. The cabin crew consisted of 7 experienced flight attendants. At 9:01 a.m., the ground controller cleared them to taxi to runway 31 left. Everything was routine, but ahead of them, a Japan Airlines Boeing 747, one of the largest aircraft in the sky, had just been cleared for takeoff. The wake turbulence from that jumbo jet was about to set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. At 9:11 a.m., the tower cleared the 747 for takeoff. Inside the cockpit of Flight 587, the first officer asked the captain, "You happy with that distance?" The captain reassured him, "We'll be all right once we get rolling. He's supposed to be 5 miles by the time we're airborne." At 9 hours, 13 minutes, and 28 seconds, the tower cleared Flight 587 for takeoff. The Airbus accelerated down the runway and lifted off at 9 hours, 14 minutes, and 29 seconds, 1 minute and 40 seconds after the 747. As they climbed through 1,700 feet, at 9 hours, 15 minutes, and 36 seconds, the flight data recorder showed a sudden drop in load factors. They had flown into the wake turbulence from the Japan Airlines 747. Wake turbulence is invisible. Massive rotating columns of air that trail behind large aircraft. A 747 creates vortices that can rotate at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour at their core and can persist for several minutes. The first officer reacted immediately, making control inputs to stabilize the aircraft. Within seconds, they had recovered. At 9 hours, 15 minutes, and 44 seconds, the captain said calmly, Little wake turbulence, huh? Yeah, the first officer replied. The aircraft continued climbing. Everything seemed fine. But 15 seconds later, at 9 hours, 15 minutes, and 51 seconds, they hit the wake vortex again. This time, it was worse. The second encounter was more severe. The aircraft rolled 25 degrees left wing down. And this time, the first officer's response was different. This time, he didn't just use the control wheel. This time, he reached for the rudder pedals. The flight data recorder shows he pushed the rudder pedals aggressively, not just once, but repeatedly. Right rudder, left rudder, right rudder, left rudder. Large, alternating inputs. At 9 hours, 15 minutes, and 54 seconds, in a strained voice, the first officer called out, "Max power!" The captain asked, "You all right?" "Yeah, I'm fine," the first officer responded. 1 second later, the captain urged, "Hang on to it! Hang on to it!"
Power! You all right? Yeah, I'm fine. Hang on to it! Hang on to it!
But something catastrophic was already happening. At the base of the vertical stabilizer, the tail fin, 6 main attachment lugs made of carbon fiber composite were being subjected to forces they were never designed to handle. The aircraft was traveling at 250 knots. At that speed, even small rudder deflections create massive aerodynamic forces. But the first officer wasn't making small inputs. He was making nearly full deflection inputs, alternating rapidly from side to side. Between 9 hours, 15 minutes, and 52 seconds and 9 hours, 15 minutes, and 58 seconds, the rudder pedals moved 5 times. 1.7 inches right, 1.7 inches left, 1.7 inches right, 2.0 inches right, 2.4 inches left, and 1.3 inches right. With each reversal, the loads on the vertical stabilizer were building beyond anything the designers had anticipated. At 9:15, the right rear main attachment lug fractured. The carbon fiber composite material, stressed beyond its limits, failed suddenly and completely. The entire vertical stabilizer, all 7,000 pounds of it, separated from the aircraft. The cockpit voice recorder captured the sound. A loud bang. The aircraft was now uncontrollable. Without its vertical stabilizer, Flight 587 was aerodynamically doomed. The vertical stabilizer is what keeps an aircraft flying straight. Without it, the aircraft cannot be controlled in yaw. At 9 hours, 16 minutes, and 1 second, the first officer's voice, "Holy!" followed by an expletive. At 9 hours, 16 minutes, and 4 seconds, a stall warning chime sounded. At 9 hours, 16 minutes, and 7 seconds, the first officer said, confused and desperate, he still thought they were in wake turbulence. He had no idea the aircraft's tail had separated. At 9 hours, 16 minutes, and 12 seconds, the captain's final words, "Get out of it. Get out of it." 2 seconds later, the cockpit voice recorder stopped. The engines, stressed beyond their design limits by the violent yawing motion, separated from the wings in midair. The left engine crashed into a gas station in Belle Harbor, Queens. The right engine destroyed a home. The fuselage slammed into the residential streets of Belle Harbor at over 300 miles per hour at approximately 9 hours, 16 minutes, and 15 seconds a.m. 4 homes were completely destroyed. 3 more sustained substantial damage. All 260 people on board perished instantly. 5 people on the ground were killed. In total, 265 people lost their lives. For New Yorkers still traumatized by September 11th, the sight of smoke rising over Queens was a nightmare made real again. In those first chaotic hours, many feared the worst. Was this another terrorist attack? The National Transportation Safety Board mobilized immediately. The FBI joined the investigation. The world held its breath. But As investigators examined the wreckage, the flight data recorder, and the cockpit voice recorder, a different picture emerged. This was not terrorism. This was something far more complex. The vertical stabilizer was recovered from Jamaica Bay. The right rear attachment lug had fractured in a cleavage tension failure mode. The material had been subjected to loads that exceeded its ultimate design strength. But here's what made this accident so controversial. The aircraft had been designed and certified according to all applicable regulations. It had met every requirement. It had passed every test. So what went wrong? The investigation revealed a perfect storm of three factors. First, the rudder control system design. The Airbus A300-600 used a variable stop rudder limiting system. As airspeed increased, the rudder pedals would travel less distance to achieve full rudder deflection. At low speeds, it took 4 inches of pedal travel and 65 pounds of force to move the rudder to its limit. But at 250 knots, it took only 1.2 inches of pedal travel and 32 pounds of force. The rudder had become incredibly sensitive, and the pilots hadn't been trained on this characteristic. They didn't understand how dramatically the pedal sensitivity changed with airspeed. Second, the pilot's training. The first officer had attended American Airlines' Advanced Aircraft Maneuvering Program. This training emphasized using all available controls, including the rudder, to recover from upsets. But it didn't emphasize the dangers of aggressive rudder inputs at high speeds. In 1997, 4 years before the accident, the first officer had made aggressive rudder inputs during a wake turbulence encounter on a different flight. A captain who witnessed it was so surprised that he discussed it with the first officer afterward, telling him his use of the rudder was quite aggressive. But this incident was never formally documented. The first officer had developed a technique of using aggressive rudder inputs to counter wake turbulence, a technique he believed was correct based on his training. Third, the certification standards. The regulations required that the vertical stabilizer withstand a single, full rudder deflection at any speed up to the design maneuvering speed. But they did not require testing for alternating full rudder inputs in opposite directions. Why? Because no one thought a pilot would ever make such inputs. It was considered an unrealistic extreme maneuver. Until Flight 587, the alternating rudder inputs had created a phenomenon called aircraft pilot coupling, where the pilot's control inputs and the aircraft's response create a feedback loop that amplifies oscillations. With each rudder reversal, the loads built up beyond the vertical stabilizer's design limits. On October 26, 2004, the NTSB issued its final report. The probable cause: the in-flight separation of the vertical stabilizer as a result of the loads beyond ultimate design that were created by the first officer's unnecessary and excessive rudder pedal inputs. Contributing factors: characteristics of the Airbus A300-600 rudder system design and elements of the American Airlines Advanced Aircraft Maneuvering Program. The findings were controversial. Families felt the first officer was being blamed while Airbus and American Airlines escaped accountability. But the NTSB issued sweeping safety recommendations. Airlines worldwide revised their upset recovery training to emphasize that the rudder should not be used aggressively at high speeds. Airbus issued bulletins warning pilots about the risks of large, alternating rudder inputs. The FAA updated guidance on design maneuvering speed information. Certification standards were reviewed. Today, the lessons of Flight 587 are taught in every airline training program. Pilots learn about the dangers of over-controlling. Engineers understand the need to consider worst-case pilot inputs, even ones that seem unrealistic. 265 people died that November morning in Belle Harbor. The victims included families traveling together, young people starting their adult lives, elderly retirees. They were from the Dominican Republic, the United States, and other countries. Each had a story, dreams, people who loved them. The passengers included parents traveling with young children, some as young as 2 years old. There were elderly couples, business travelers, friends traveling together. Each person was heading to Santo Domingo for their own reasons, visiting family, returning home, starting new chapters in their lives. On the ground, 5 residents of Belle Harbor were killed, simply in the wrong place at the wrong moment. They had survived September 11th, only to die in another aviation disaster 2 months later. The memorial services were heartbreaking. Many victims' remains were never identified. Families coped with sudden, violent, unexpected loss. But from this tragedy came changes that have saved lives. Their deaths were not meaningless. Their deaths led to improvements in aviation safety that protect every person who flies today. Their memory serves as a reminder. In aviation, complacency is the enemy. Every accident teaches us something. Every lesson costs something. Before Flight 587, the aviation community assumed pilots would never make alternating, full-deflection rudder inputs at high speeds. That assumption was wrong. Before Flight 587, the aviation community assumed that training pilots to use all controls aggressively during upsets was always right. That assumption needed refinement. Before Flight 587, the aviation community assumed certification standards were adequate. That assumption needed updating. The aviation community learned. The changes were made. The training was updated. And no similar accident has occurred in the more than 2 decades since. That is the legacy of American Airlines Flight 587. That is how we honor the memory of the 265 people who died. Not by forgetting, but by remembering. By learning. By changing. Because the next time you board an aircraft, the safety improvements that protect you were written in the blood of 265 people who died on a clear November morning in New York City. Flight 587 departed JFK at 9 hours 14 minutes and 29 seconds a.m., bound for Santo Domingo. It crashed at 9 hours 16 minutes and 15 seconds a.m., just 106 seconds after takeoff. Less than 2 minutes separated routine departure from catastrophic disaster. The captain and first officer were experienced professionals who did nothing intentionally wrong. They responded to wake turbulence using techniques they had been trained to use. Neither knew those inputs were creating loads that would tear the vertical stabilizer from the aircraft. They died doing their jobs, trying to save their aircraft and passengers. They died because of gaps in our collective knowledge. Gaps that could only be revealed through disaster. But from that disaster came knowledge. From knowledge came change. And from change came safety improvements that protect millions of passengers every year. American Airlines Flight 587 will never be forgotten. The 265 people who died will never be forgotten. Their legacy lives on in every pilot trained on these lessons, in every aircraft designed with them in mind, in every regulation updated to reflect what we learned. Flight 587 taught us lessons about aircraft design, pilot training, certification standards, and human factors. Those lessons came at a terrible cost, but they have made aviation safer. This is the story of American Airlines Flight 587, a story of tragedy, but also a story of how the aviation community learned, changed, and made sure those who died did not die in vain. May they rest in peace. And may we never forget the lessons their deaths taught us. Flight 587, never forgotten.